Brilliant. Hello. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Hadar. So as Hadar mentioned, I'm Sophia, and thank you so much for having me here today. It's very exciting talking to you all. I am the lead at TechZero, and we are a group of over 244 companies of all sizes that are committed to reaching net zero. So for the next 20 minutes or so, I'll give you an introduction to the RaceToZero and TechZero, talk through what net zero actually means, and then we'll have a little break. And then after that, I'll invite some of the TechZero members to speak to you and share their stories. And then of course, we'll have time for questions. So the Race to Zero. The Race to Zero, as you probably know by now, is the UN-backed global campaign that rallies companies, cities, financial and educational institutions to take rigorous and immediate action to halve global emissions by 2030 and create a fairer, healthier, net zero carbon world by 2050. And together, they form the largest growing alliance of non-state actors committed to climate action. So these are some of the big players, the ones you've heard of, UBQ as mentioned there. Cities and educational institutions can also join the race, as I mentioned, and Tel Aviv and Haifa have joined the race through the city's Race to Zero. But this slide isn't to say that only big corporations can pledge to reach net zero. There are thousands of startups and scale-ups already committed. In fact, in TechZero, 35% of our members are micro businesses, so those with fewer than 10 employees. And then another 34% are small businesses, so those between 10 and 50 employees. So when you commit to the Race to Zero, what you're committing to is the minimum criteria, which are represented by these 4 Ps. So you pledge at the head of organization level to reach net zero as soon as possible by 2050 at the latest. And you also pledge to set short-term targets to achieve in the next decade. So as I said, namely halving your emissions by 2030. Within 12 months of joining, you have a plan in place explaining what actions you'll take towards achieving your short and long-term targets. And you proceed to take immediate action towards achieving net zero, and then you publish, so by publishing your report and your progress annually. So who are we? TechZero is an official partner to the UN Race to Zero, meaning any business that signs up to TechZero also joins the race. And it also means that our guidance and commitments that we ask our companies to sign up to align with the UN Race to Zero. There are several partner organizations who are part of the UN Race to Zero, some with similar pledges to ours, but what sets us apart, and the reason I'm talking to you all today, is that TechZero is specifically for tech companies, meaning we can focus on the sustainability challenges that are specific to the tech industry, because companies in the same industry are likely to face the same challenges. So we want to bring them all together to work together to make progress faster. So when a business joins TechZero, they sign up to these ambitious but achievable climate commitments that are aligned to the 4 Ps that I showed earlier. So they pledge to annually measure their emissions, have an action plan within a year of joining, and publish their emissions and progress annually. And that's pretty much it. So we really emphasize also communicating your targets, because it not only increases accountability and transparency, but it also sends the message to the wider industry, global governments, that this is what businesses are doing, this is the direction we're heading, and they better keep up. But really, more than a set of commitments, we are a community. So we really urge collaboration, sharing information, successes, failures, anything that will help us reach net zero faster. And that's why I've invited some of our members along today who'll tell their stories, and we'll hear from them a bit later. But these are just a few of the testimonials, if you will, from TechZero members. So not only have we enabled businesses to get a handle on their carbon emissions and how they can reduce them, some companies have changed their business model entirely to become sustainability focused. So for example, I spoke to one CEO who had no idea what net zero was before joining TechZero. They started out as just a hotel booking service for businesses, and now they specifically help businesses book hotels with the lowest carbon footprint. So we heard a bit from Uriel, thank you, about why companies should aim for net zero, the investment that's going into this. But I just wanted to kind of re-emphasize what companies can get from joining something like the UN Race to Zero. So companies are already being rewarded for climate action. There have been several studies and surveys showing that socially and environmentally responsible companies have higher returns compared to those who don't have clear values. And one of the reasons, or some of the reasons for this, is that those businesses attract and retain both talent and customers. So these are some stats from a CARPI report from later last year. 87% of customers have a more positive image of a company that supports social and environmental issues. 88% will be more loyal to a company that supports these issues. And this goes for both customers and staff, particularly millennials and Gen Z. These are the generations who are more likely to look for jobs with purpose. 87% would buy a product with social and environmental benefit if given the chance, and 92% would be more likely to trust a company that supports social and environmental issues. But honestly, all areas of a business can benefit because, say, for example, a key part of reaching net zero is identifying and removing inefficiencies. Inefficiencies are the things that cause waste. Waste is likely to signal loss of money. So increasing a business's efficiency, whether it's in operations, energy, water usage, it's likely to save money, and money that you can use to then take your business to the next level. And as you've heard, you'll stay ahead of what's coming, really, regulation. Governments and standard bodies businesses, and it's much easier to stay ahead of them and implement changes now rather than scramble to realign with legislation later on. So that is the what and the why, but something that all of our businesses say was, well, the main knowledge gap is what exactly is this thing we're all aiming for. So I thought I'd just take the time to kind of fill that gap, and hopefully you'll walk away from this with a really solid understanding of what net zero is and why the UN Race to Zero exists. So net zero is a state where greenhouse gas emissions are balanced by their removal, meaning an organization's activities result in no net impact on the climate. So practically for organizations, this means reducing your greenhouse gas emissions as far as possible, so by 90 to 95%, and compensate any remaining hard to decarbonize emissions using certified long-term carbon removal credits. So this is what it might look like. You reduce your emissions year on year, ideally offsetting as you go. That's represented by that grey portion there. You introduce carbon removals, the little purple bars, and gradually increase these until you reach a point where you can't reduce your emissions any further, but they're completely balanced by their removals. And it's important to note here that by carbon removals, we literally mean taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it for a long time. And this is through technologies such as direct air capture and storage, biochar, and mineralization. And I might touch on those a bit later as well. But also a quick note on what we mean when we say carbon footprint. Though it has carbon in the name, a carbon footprint is the total greenhouse gases emitted directly or indirectly by almost everything that we do. So when we say carbon, we're really using it as a shorthand for carbon dioxide equivalence, which is the metric used to measure greenhouse gases' contribution to global heating and their effects on the atmosphere. So I understand this is like a lot of information dumped at you at once. So before I plow on with how we go through the process of net zero, are there any questions from the room? See on the screen. Great, okay, I'll just go on ahead. So of course there'll be questions later on as well. So there are three basic steps for net zero. That's measure, reduce, and remove. Pretty simple. You can't manage what you don't measure, as I'm sure all you know. It's the same in almost every business aspect. So we ask that you measure your emissions. You can use a free emissions calculator tool. There are loads of them online. I think you were introduced to GoCardless's greenhouse gas emissions calculator just ahead of this session. And you can use those to get a general idea of your emissions footprint over the last year. To form a really robust action plan, you do, of course, need to go into detail, but basic measurement tools can help direct early action by revealing where some easy wins might be, where you can take easy action. And so we recommend, but by no means force, allocating a budget to work to help you work with experts such as Shibboleth to help you measure your carbon footprint. If you don't have a budget for this, a great rule of thumb is to look at your accounting spend, as that will roughly map your biggest sources of carbon emissions. But on a basic level, it is quite simple to get a general overview of your carbon footprint. All you need to do, look at the activities that you need to run your business, put a figure on each of them. A lot of carbon measurement is just an exercise in data collection, as I'm sure our members will tell you. And then you calculate the emissions by multiplying these values by emissions factors, which can be found online and which will be included in some of the resources after today's session. From that, you get a total carbon footprint and how each business activity contributes. And it's really important here to say that what's important is to not let perfect be the enemy of the good. It's more important to start somewhere with the commitment of improving over time. So when you can't get real data, it's fine to use a best guess or industry averages and just knowing that you'll improve it the next time round. This was just a little quote which I really liked from a workshop that we did last year. So carbon calculating like you improve it over time. And when it comes to measuring, you'll hear a lot of jargon. One thing that you'll need to have your head around is the different scopes. So just as you break big tasks down into smaller tasks, so you can break down your footprint into 3 smaller footprints. Scope 1 and 2 are the emissions directly within your control, such as your fleet of vehicles or the electricity you purchase from your office. Scope 3 is all other upstream and downstream emissions, your supply chain and employees working from home. Any credible net zero plan must account for scope 3, as purchasing decisions in your value chain have a really big impact on the planet, which you'll see in just a second. And this is what it would look like in practice. I would recommend taking a look at Pawprint's carbon report to see how they've measured and presented their carbon footprint. It lays it out really clearly, has a lot of detail. So here they've got all the business activities and then broken it down into which scope they fall under. And then they get this. And so they see that scope 3 is the largest source of emissions, as it will be for most companies. I think most of our members say that scope 3 accounts for 90, sometimes more, 90% than 90% of all their emissions. So here they'd be able to really focus their efforts on reducing their scope 3. So number 2, and I've been a bit sneaky and I've given you 2 for the price of 1 here. And that's because whilst reduction, especially short-term reduction, is the most important part of the whole thing, in order to reduce your emissions effectively, you need a target to aim for, obviously. So your target shows how much you need to reduce your emissions by each year. And what makes it science-based is that it's in line with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. It is really important to include short-term targets, as I mentioned, as these targets show that you're serious about climate change, or climate action, I should say, right now, rather than kicking the can down the road, seeing net zero as something to be tackled later on. But more importantly for businesses, having those short-term targets really helps you embed sustainability into your business strategy. And again, this is what it might look like in practice. So Pawprint has calculated their emissions. They've set a science-based target for 2050, but then they've broken it down into 5-year intervals, which shows that they need to reduce their emissions on average 30% per year. And they've gone into even more detail here, breaking it down into different targets for each scope and every 5 years. But I guess what you're probably all thinking is, how do you reach these targets? That's probably the most important thing. How do you choose where to start when it comes to reducing emissions? Your measurements, as I said, should reveal your biggest sources of carbon emissions, and we've found that they're likely to fall into 5 key areas: energy, what your business is run on; supply chain, how you engage with your suppliers, both upstream and downstream; travel, how you do it, and what policies are in place to make sure that it's sustainable; employees, how you can engage them to minimize their home and office working footprint; and customers, how they use your products and services. The good news is that depending on your company's size and business model, it is possible to make big reductions pretty quickly. One of our members, Supercritical, who specialize in carbon accounting from software, found that most of their customers can reduce their emissions by up to 25% with a few big changes. And I even heard of one small company who were able to cut their emissions in half simply by switching how their data was stored. So it is possible to make big savings pretty quickly. But of course, all businesses and teams are unique. There's no one-size-fits-all plan for how to reduce your emissions. But once you've identified these areas, like everything in business, it's a matter of prioritizing possible actions and planning their deployment. We'll go into a bit more detail about reduction, how other companies have done it in the next session. We'll maybe have a little break before that. But there's one more element to this, and then I promise I'll stop talking. You can go and get a coffee or something. So the priority in the net zero plan is to reduce, as I said, but as you do so, you should remove carbon to compensate for what can't. So remember, this means literally taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it for a long time. The reason why I keep emphasizing this is that most forms of carbon offsetting that you might be familiar with are not carbon removal. The most common and cheapest offsetting projects are what's known as avoided emissions projects, projects where you pay someone else not to emit a ton of CO2. These projects are things like clean cook stoves, renewable energy, or ecosystem protection. The problem here is, if your company emits a ton and you pay someone else to not emit a ton, your ton of carbon dioxide is still out there warming the planet. And climate science demands that we must reduce emissions and take CO2 out of the atmosphere. Tree planting, which is another really popular form of offsetting, is carbon removal. That's the good news. But it is short term due to they can burn down, deforestation, uncertain lifespan. Also increasingly seeing problems resulting from planting monocultures, so just planting one of the same tree, which is destroying ecosystems, and disputes around land availability and custodianship, things like that. The most long-term carbon removal involves these nascent technologies, which I mentioned before, and these really require investment in order for them to scale. And this is happening. As you've seen, there's a lot of money going into this right now, though we'd love, of course, to see it move faster, have more companies invest in this kind of technology, with the hope that these will scale the way solar did. So the cost of solar fell something like 82% in the last decade, and we're hoping that the same will go for carbon removal. So to go back to this slide, we're not saying that avoided emissions offsets are a bad idea or not to do them, not at all. They are a great thing to do while you reduce your emissions, but ultimately only carbon removals count towards net zero. So if you were to balance 100% of your emissions with avoidance offsets, as shown by the gray area, so say renewable energy projects or clean cook stoves, those kind of things, you'll be carbon neutral, which is brilliant, but it is not the same thing as net zero. Okay, I hope you're not completely overwhelmed. The good news is that for everything I just went through, TechZero and other UN RaceToZero organizations exist to help. So with that maybe hand back over to Hadar, and then after the break, I might hear from you potentially, and then we can hear from some TechZero members to see how they've reduced their emissions.
Yeah, maybe we'll have some questions, if someone has any questions.
Yeah.
What you just discussed.
Yeah, actually, I have a quick question. So with tech companies, with startups, there's companies that today are with 100 employees, and in 5 years they will have 1,000 employees.
Yes.
And then the calculations that they will make today will not be relevant for 5 years, unlike corporates that are not growing in this, size. How do you address this? Because in the end, we're speaking about a total amount of tons of CO2, which is not by. I mean, how can they address it according to their growth? Because these companies are growing, unlike corporates that are not growing in the same pace.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a brilliant question. And I'm sure that some of our members, I know we've got Ben Knight from GoCardless who will be able to attest to that, James from MSQ. We have recently published a little guide on this because, a lot of the companies we work with are startups and they are planning to grow exponentially. So one thing that we say to do is kind of plan ahead where you think you might be. I mean, and set targets at the same time as your financial targets. So you're going to grow. So project yourself into the future and also measure the carbon for how many offices you think you'd have, how many employees you'd have, and then try and, again, identify what areas of your growing business are more likely to mean that your emissions will grow as well, and see how you can put policies in place to make sure they don't grow at the same rate as your business and your team. And another way to do it is, rather than focusing on absolute emissions, so say 100 tons of CO2, you focus on your, my brain's...
Intensity-based, Sophia, is the word you're looking for.
Sorry?
It's intensity-based emissions.
Yes,
I think is the word.
That's it. Too early in the morning here.
That's okay.
Intensity-based targets. So that is where you divide your absolute emissions by another business metric, say your revenue or the number of employees you have, so by head count. And so say MSQ's intensity ratio is 5 tons of CO2 per employee. That might be ridiculous, but 5 tons of CO2 per employee. You're making sure that there are policies in place that mean that won't grow. So even if you have 1,000 employees, it either stays at 5 per employee or ideally reduces. James, did you want to talk about?
Yeah, because it's a really good point. I mean, you're absolutely right in that it's absolutely right to measure your intensity based, right? So if you're growing by 10-fold, and you're halving your emissions in absolute terms might go up. Now, it's also fair to say that, in my opinion, the Science-Based Target Initiative, so the place where we formally commit these net zero targets, hasn't really figured this out yet properly for fast-growing startups. It's true that we have to have a reduction in absolute terms. Climate change doesn't play nicely with economic growth. It doesn't matter. If you're Apple and you halve your emissions, but you sell 10 times more devices, that's no good. That doesn't work. But you're right. It's very different from a startup today, because if you're going to submit a formal net zero target, you do have to show that it is a 90% reduction in absolute terms. Now, if you're a 10-person startup today and you're going to be 1,000 people, it's ridiculous, really. And in fact, you're right, the SBTI doesn't kind of really work. But I think we have to take a more pragmatic view. I think there will be more guidance coming for professional service businesses, how you factor that in, on, especially if it's on a per head basis, because it's a zero-sum game in terms of population growth. It's a very astute question, and I'm not giving you a super clear answer. There are certainly ways you can measure it. It's absolutely fine to divide your emissions by head count or by revenue, as Sophia says, but it does actually make it difficult for you to set an official net zero target at the moment. But I think we'll see that change.
And I think that's also where updating those targets comes in. So every 5 years you get to review, or less than 5 years you get to review. So yeah, thanks, James.
Thank you.
I have another question. How do you take into account in the matters the actual product that, especially us as companies that work on removing, for example, remilk or remove cows from the ecosystem, or us where we produce alternative protein to replace the need for beef or for soy, for anything else from microalgae, that doesn't go into account in the calculations, or we actually remove very polluting, very high emissions from the environment, replacing it with a more sustainable source, and eventually calculating how much our offices and cars emit is negligible compared to the effect we have on the environment. And so I feel like calculating these kinds of numbers doesn't really show the true picture of what startups like us do to net zero eventually.
That's also a really great point. And I completely hear what you're saying. And I think part of that is, it is just good. So on one hand, you are just looking at your business and what your business does in kind of isolation to the good, as you said, the good things that you result in. But I think it's, first of all, just good to get a handle on your emissions as a company, just to make sure they don't increase, because that is very important for, reaching a whole net zero world and economy. But then that's not to say that when you do all those things, you just have to leave out everything good you've done. So in those reports, it is really great to include all that, say that, this is our footprint, but really it is negligible because we have led to a reduction of emissions in this part of the world. So that's not to say that you need to leave them out of what you're reporting and what you're doing, but it is just a kind of exercise in making sure that your business itself is also as sustainable as possible.
Sophia, can I?
Sorry?
Yeah, sorry, can I just clarify we understand what you're saying? Are you saying then that when you're doing the data gathering that you spoke about, the collection exercise, and you sort of had a icon talking about your customers, that basically if you can come up with a calculation that saying if you're selling protein, sustainable protein, and you basically can come up with a data calculation which estimates how much protein that replaces that was from a non-carbon kind of friendly source.
So I'd say
that's something you can include in your stats.
Yes, but then, so there's either that way to do it, or just as a kind of separate thing that you can put in the report is, say, if our technology didn't exist and it was done this way, this is how much CO2 could be released into the atmosphere, and this is how much we've saved by allowing members or customers to use our product.
Yeah, I agree. I think to be really clear, sorry, Sophia, it is a separate thing. So in other words, let me give another example. Tesla, who actually don't have great sustainability scores, right? They have very bad mining operations, quite a high carbon footprint. They cannot say for every Tesla that we sell, that reduces emissions by 2.5 tons a year, because that's the average that a diesel car would kick out. So you can't sort of report negative emissions just because your product sort of does something good and offsets that. You would have to report on the emissions of your operations. So you obviously have to manufacture this stuff, you have staff, you have emissions, but absolutely you should be shouting from the treetops in the same reports as Sophia is saying, and like, look at the impact that we're having, as Tesla could do. Look at the impact of all these electric vehicles, but you can't sort of report negative emissions in that way. It's similar for us. We build very large digital platforms, and I talk a lot about the digital footprints. The internet has a larger carbon footprint than the airline industry, and we work very hard to reduce the digital emissions of our very large clients, and that has a very big impact, that work that we do. We shout about that and we talk about that and we tell our customers about it, but we can't factor that in. It doesn't counterbalance our own emissions, rightly or wrongly, but those are the rules at the moment, I think, just to be clear.
Yeah, because what we don't want to happen is for the kind of Jevons paradox to happen, where some companies go, you know what, we're saving all the CO2 over here so we can kind of ramp up our emissions because it kind of balances out. That's something we want to avoid.
If I could just make a comment. I think if I recall, the GHG protocol at one time proposed a scope 4 category, which actually relates to these avoided emissions, because it's not part of the footprint, but because you want to scream it out at the treetops, then a proposition of a scope 4, which can relate to those avoided emissions.
Yes, I think it's important because, again, also us, and I can also speak, I think, for women, the more emissions we put into the atmosphere, it's actually better because we're removing emissions from different industries. I mean, the more fermenters remake have, the larger their production is, and the more alternative protein we produce, our emissions will be very high, but it will remove like 90% of the emissions that beef produce if we weren't there. And if we provide these numbers, and then say, well, these are the numbers, we actually increased our emissions 10-fold, 1,000-fold, but don't worry, because actually we're removing alternative protein, we're removing the existing protein from the market. I mean, it's a bias. I mean, because the numbers people will see if we use the calculator will show that our emissions actually increased dramatically. But this is a wrong way to look at the picture.
And I think the answer to that is we should be putting pressure on the SBTi to adopt things like that scope 4 thing, which I haven't heard about. But it's exactly the same for these carbon capture companies, right? Direct air capture is very, very energy intensive, and you need to run it from renewable energy and things like that. But we need them to scale. Those processes, will have emissions. So I think you're right. I think at the moment the official mechanisms need another layer on it for tech companies like yourselves, because of course they're not aimed at that. They're aimed at the big traditional legacy businesses. And so at the moment, I wouldn't worry about it too much. I think it's amazing. Like, fingers crossed your company grows and we see your emissions grow. That's a brilliant thing for the planet, and we of course need to see the official guidance change so that you don't have to explain that. But that, that's where it is at the moment, in my understanding at least.
I think that it is solved as long as more companies will join the race to zero emission. Let's say a dairy producer, and he will start using your technology, he will reduce his emissions. So it's just who along the supply chain is going to enjoy the saving, and you are selling him the tool. So you are valued already as a scope 4, what you've called. You, by definition, something that is generating a reduction of, so somebody that is really going to go to RaceToZero and can be a client of your technology, right, should pay for what he's paying is already included in the package for the products you're giving for his supply chain, as well as the carbon reduction. I mean, it cannot be it's a one bill, but it includes his your functional price and carbon reduction. So I think it's already in your model, from more demand that will come from companies that would like to replace their existing sources with alternative, more sustainable sources, as you are making.
No, this is absolutely correct. These large food companies are just under the pressure to change their supply and find alternatives, and they're doing exactly what you're saying.
You're the scope 3. You're
the 90%. We are the scope 3, and
they will enjoy it. And they have to pay. That's why they will pay, I guess, a bit more for now for this type of alternative proteins, because it's worth them in the calculation for what they are receiving in their goals to become net zero.
In general, all the system is a recursive system, because it depends on your supply chain, and the scope 3 is forcing, like if it's the big companies are forcing the smaller suppliers all the way, yeah, but not just in this industry.
I'm going to give you 5 minutes,
okay,
maybe a short break for coffee, and then we can jump into the second part when you can hear more from James and Ben and Sally on their journeys for us.
Great.
Okay, 5 minutes.